The security guard handed her a brown envelope at 9:07 a.m. on a Thursday, and he did it without looking at her face. Inside was a single page. Her termination letter. After 11 years, 4 months, and 17 days of employment at Meridian Capital Group, Chidinma Okafor was being released. The reason listed was restructuring. The signature at the bottom belonged to Gerald Adeyemi, CEO. What Gerald did not know, what none of the people in that building understood as they watched her walk through the lobby for the last time, was that Chidinma had been making a very different kind of plan for the past 6 months. And the man who had signed that letter was, as of 9:08 a.m., on that Thursday morning, the last person on earth who understood what he had just set in motion. Chidinma was 43 years old and weighed 57 kilograms, though she had been 64 kilograms the year before, when she still ate proper dinners. She wore a navy blazer she had bought at a second-hand shop on South Boulevard for $8, and she had pressed it the night before with an iron that kept cutting out every 4 minutes. The blazer was clean. The collar sat exactly right. She had made sure of that before she left her apartment at 6:40 a.m., standing in front of a bathroom mirror the size of a dinner tray, making herself presentable for a building that had never once made her feel present. She had come to Meridian Capital Group in 2013 as a junior financial analyst, one of 3 hired that year from outside the firm's usual recruiting pipelines. She had stayed because she was good, better than good. She could read a balance sheet the way her grandmother read weather, not just the numbers, but the thing underneath the numbers, the shape of what was hidden. The smell of risk before risk showed its face. By her 3rd year, she was the one the senior analysts came to quietly, after hours, when a client's portfolio looked wrong in a way they could not name. She named it every time. She just never received credit for naming it, because credit in that building had its own geography, and it did not run toward the east-facing windows on the 14th floor where she sat. Her desk had been against that east window for 11 years. She had watched the sun come up over the Charlotte Business District 2,714 mornings from that chair, while her colleagues arrived 2 hours later and left 2 hours before her. She had never complained about this. She had never pointed it out. Her mother had given her a leather-bound notebook in 2009, soft brown calfskin with a clasp that clicked twice when you closed it. Her mother had bought it at Makola Market in Accra during a visit and had shipped it across to Charlotte in a box with a note tucked inside that said, "I want you to write down what you know, Chidinma, not what they tell you. What you know." That notebook went everywhere with her. By the morning the security guard handed her the envelope, it was nearly full, and it had never contained anything Meridian Capital Group had told her to think. She read the termination letter standing in the lobby. She did not read it a second time. She pressed the envelope flat against her chest, the way her mother had taught her to hold things that needed to be kept still, and she stood for a moment in the marble-floored lobby with its high ceilings and its permanently cool air conditioning that hummed at a frequency she had never learned to stop noticing after 11 years. The security desk was 15 feet to her left. The guard had already looked away. 2 women from the 3rd-floor accounts team came out of the elevator and glanced at her, and then looked at each other and kept walking toward the exit. One of them held the door, not for Chidinma, for the woman beside her. The door swung shut. She walked out through the revolving glass doors onto the street. A woman selling roasted corn from a cart on the corner looked up. Chidinma looked back. Neither of them spoke. Chidinma turned left and walked 9 blocks to a coffee shop on Moorhead Street that she had never been to before, because she did not want to be anywhere familiar. She ordered a cup of ginger tea and sat at a table near the window. The tea cost $4.25. She paid with exact change from the bottom of her bag. She opened the brown notebook, not the leather one, a different one, spiral-bound, which she had been filling for the past 6 months, and she looked at what was already written there. 41 pages. Numbers, names, institutional names, filing dates, a timeline that started on March 14th and ended this morning. She closed it without adding anything. Then she sat with both hands around the cup until the tea went cold. Gerald Adeyemi had been CEO of Meridian Capital Group for 3 years and 2 months. He was 57, carried himself like a man who had never been told no in a room where it counted, and had a particular habit of speaking to the junior staff by addressing a point 2 inches to the left of their heads. He wore bespoke suits from a tailor on Trade Street and kept a framed photograph of himself with 3 former heads of state on the wall of his corner office, which faced west, directly opposite Chidinma's east-facing window. He had arrived at Meridian from a competing firm where he had been, by all accounts, effective, or at least effective at the things that got measured. Revenue, headline client growth, the appearance of institutional confidence. He had never learned Chidinma's name. Not in 11 years. He called her the analyst, or one of your people when speaking to her direct supervisor. A man named Tobena who had worked at Meridian for 9 years, and who had the look of someone who had learned a long time ago that the safest thing in that building was to agree with the person above you. Tobena had passed Chidinma's work upward under his own name on 4 separate occasions. She knew. She had kept a record. She had said nothing, because she understood the architecture of that building and she was building something of her own. On the 2 occasions she had presented findings directly to the board, 2018 and 2022, both times flagging risks that the firm's own models had missed. Gerald had sat at the head of the table and responded to her recommendations by directing all follow-up questions to the man sitting beside her. A man who had been at the company for 18 months and whose primary qualification was that he looked like what Gerald believed a Meridian analyst should look like. Both times, what she had flagged had been correct. Both times, the follow-up went to the other man. She had written both incidents in the leather notebook and kept moving. The restructuring that removed Chidinma also removed 7 other people from the mid-level analytical division. The announcement went out company-wide at 9:15 a.m. and described it as a strategic realignment. The word restructuring had appeared 4 times in the official communication. Not once had the word risk appeared, which was interesting, because risk was precisely what this was about. Meridian Capital Group had spent the previous 2 years quietly absorbing a level of exposure in its client investment portfolios that its own internal risk models had failed to capture. The exposure was not catastrophic yet. The portfolios were not bleeding, but they were leaning, the way a structure leans when one of its supports has been slowly compromised and nobody has run the full inspection. Chidinma had run the inspection. She had been running it for 4 months without being asked to, because that was the kind of analyst she was. The kind who could not sit across from a balance sheet that smelled wrong and do nothing about it. She had filed an internal report in March, 11 pages, specific, documented, with 3 concrete recommendations and a projected timeline of vulnerability if action was not taken. She had flagged the email as urgent. She had addressed it to Gerald and to 3 board members whose oversight portfolios covered risk management. The email had been read. She knew because the system generated delivery receipts, and she had kept them, and all 4 recipients had opened the message within 48 hours. Nobody had responded. Not by email, not by phone, not by walking 14 floors down to ask her a single question. What she had done next was not something she discussed. She kept a copy of the report. She kept the email. She kept the read receipts. She kept every subsequent internal document related to the portfolios she had analyzed, the public-facing versions accessible to any subscriber with the right financial databases, and she organized them in chronological order in the spiral-bound notebook. She did this not because she was building a case. She did it because her mother's voice was in her head, and her mother had told her to write down what she knew. And what she knew was that she had been right in March. And being right in that building and not being listened to were the same thing that had been happening to her for 11 years. And one day, the difference between right and listened to would matter in a way that had to be documented. She had been correct about when that day would come. She had not been correct about exactly what form it would take. In the days following the termination, the building on Camden Road was very quiet in a way that had texture to it. Her neighbors moved around in their morning routines behind thin walls, a chair scraping on a floor, a door to a bathroom pulled shut, the particular mechanical wheeze of the elevator that never quite reached her floor before it changed its mind. She heard all of it without processing any of it. She woke before sunrise each day. She made tea on the stovetop, using her mother's recipe. Cloves and dried lemongrass she had been buying in small paper bags from a West African grocery on Central Avenue for 6 years, added to water brought up slowly to a simmer until the apartment smelled like her mother's kitchen in Accra. The one she had not stood in for 4 years because the plane ticket cost $1,847, and there was never a month when that number felt possible. She stood at the kitchen window while the kettle worked. The building across the alley was close enough to see lights going on in other apartments, and she watched those lights the way you watch things when you were thinking about something else entirely. Then she sat at the table and worked. She did not file for unemployment in the first week. She did not call anyone at Meridian. She spent the first 3 days organizing what she had into categories and sequences. The risk report and its appendices, the email chain with read receipts, the public portfolio documents and their internal cross-references, the timeline 37 dated entries from March 14th through the morning of her termination, each one timed to the minute, each one sourced. By the end of the 3rd day, the organizing was done, and the picture was very clear. She also began to see something she had not seen before, or had seen but not let herself name. The portfolio restructuring that had followed her March report, carried out quietly in the weeks after the 4 read receipts had come back without a single response, had not been random. It had moved exposure in a specific direction, away from the clients with legal teams and towards smaller institutional investors who lacked the capacity to run the kind of analysis she had run. She had the public data on those accounts. She had looked at the dates. She had looked at what moved and where it went. She had written it all down in the spiral notebook, and then she had closed the notebook and made another cup of tea and sat very still at the kitchen table for a long time. On the 4th day after the termination, she called a woman she knew from a professional association she had belonged to for several years, a quarterly dinner group of black women in finance who met at a restaurant on Tryon Street. The woman she called was Zuri Ndukwe, 51 years old, 23 years in securities law, a voice like a closing statement. Chidinma told her everything. Zuri was quiet for a long time after Chidinma finished speaking. Then she said, "Do you still have the read receipts?" Chidinma said, "I have everything." Zuri said, "Call Pauline Akebe, 5th Street. Tell her I sent you. Tell her to read the timeline first." Pauline Akebe was 61 years old and wore reading glasses on a chain of amber beads and had a filing cabinet behind her desk that was organized not alphabetically, but by the weight of the case. Her office on 5th Street was on the 3rd floor of a building that had no elevator and smelled of old carpet and good coffee. She had been a solicitor for 32 years. She had handled 3 matters connected to Meridian Capital in the past decade. She had been watching the institution the way certain women watch certain things, quietly, from a corner, with their full attention. Chidinma placed the spiral-bound notebook on Pauline's desk. Then, the USB drive. Then the printed copy of the March report, with the email chain and the 4 read receipts in a clear plastic folder, and a separate printed timeline, 37 entries, March 14th through the morning of the termination. Each one timed, each one sourced. Pauline picked up the folder first. She read the first page, then the second, and when she turned to the third, she took off her glasses and held them by the amber bead chain and read more slowly. She did not speak until the 4th page. The office smelled of good coffee and old files. Outside the 3rd floor window, a bus groaned past on 5th Street, and the sound faded, and the room was quiet again. Then, Pauline said, "When were these emails opened?" Chidinma told her the exact times, all 4, pulled from the receipt record she had kept on a private server account she had set up the same day she sent the March filing, because she had known she would need to be able to prove this someday. Pauline set the folder down. She removed her reading glasses and held them by one arm and looked at Chidinma for a long moment without speaking. The wall clock made a small sound with every second, and it was the only sound in the room. Then Pauline said, "Give me 8 days. If this story is already sitting in your chest the way I think it is, subscribe before we get to what Pauline found on the morning of the 7th day. Because what she found is something Chidinma had seen coming from the very beginning and had been quietly waiting for someone with the right tools to confirm." Pauline's firm had spent 6 years building a working relationship with the Securities Regulatory Division of the State Financial Authority. It was not a relationship that announced itself. It was the kind built through well-timed calls, through precisely delivered paperwork, through the understanding that the cases that mattered most could never win through noise, only through documentation that was complete, organized, and impossible to set aside. She made the first call on the morning of the 3rd day. She pulled the portfolio transfer documents through 2 licensed data services on the 4th and 5th days. On the 7th day, she found what she had suspected might be there. A name on page 34 of an internal transfer authorization document from the week following Chidinma's March filing. A signature belonging to a board member who also happened, quietly, to be a significant shareholder in one of the funds that had received the reallocated risk exposure. The restructuring that had moved the problem client's risk onto the pension funds and the Enugu endowment had been authorized, in part, by someone who stood to benefit from where that risk landed. Pauline called Chidinma at 8:14 p.m. on the 7th day. She said, "Come in tomorrow." Early, she did not say anything else. Chidinma arrived at 7:50 a.m. in the navy blazer, freshly pressed. The iron had cut out 3 times. She sat across from Pauline and listened as Pauline walked her through the thread, the pension funds, the Enugu endowment, the name on page 34, the dates laid against the March report's timeline. When Pauline finished, she said, "You found the risk exposure. You reported it." They read it, said nothing, and restructured the portfolios exactly along the lines you had identified. Then they removed you 26 days after the restructuring was signed. Chidinma said, "Yes." Pauline said, "You kept everything." Chidinma said, "Yes." Pauline said, "Good." The regulatory filing was submitted on a Tuesday morning. 218 pages. Chidinma's 11-page report was page 1, dated March, red receipts attached. case number came back within 6 hours. By the following Monday, the Meridian Board had received a formal inquiry notice with a 21-day response window and a prohibition on public disclosure. The board member on page 34 had retained his own counsel by Monday afternoon. Chidinma spent those 21 days the way she had been spending every day since the envelope. She woke at 5:30 a.m. She made tea. She opened the leather notebook, the Makola Market one, the one her mother had sent from Accra, and she wrote. Not the regulatory details, those notebooks were already full. She wrote what she understood about how institutions moved when they believed they were unobserved. The shape of self-protective behavior at the organizational level. The way risk migrated through systems whose managers were confident no one was watching carefully enough. 11 years of observation turned into pages of analysis, written in precise sentences, with no emotion in them. The emotion was not the point. The understanding was the point. The board held its emergency session on the 22nd day. Gerald arrived expecting a compliance review. He had his head of legal with him. He had the confident bearing of a man who had managed his way through difficult rooms before and saw no reason to believe this one would be different. He was handed a letter from an independent governance committee he had not known existed. The committee had been convened 8 days earlier. The internal audit was complete. The risk exposure from March had been correctly identified. The subsequent restructuring had moved that exposure toward parties connected to a board member. The removal of the analyst who had produced the original report 26 days after that restructuring was finalized represented what the committee described, in 3 words, as a material control failure. Gerald's head of legal read those 3 words twice. Gerald's hands were flat on the table. He did not speak. Constance Mensah Owusu sat at the far end of the table. She was 63 years old and had been on the Meridian Board for 14 years. She looked down the length of the room at Gerald and said, "The committee's recommendation is unanimous." Gerald said, "Constance," she said, "we'll need your access credentials by end of business." The board did not simply need a replacement. They needed a reconstruction of the governance framework, of the risk management function, of the culture that had allowed a correct 11-page report to be read by 4 people and produce 0 response. They needed, in short, the kind of judgment that had written that report. They needed the kind of person who kept records when no one asked, who filed documentation when no one was listening, who pressed an envelope against her chest and walked 9 blocks and ordered tea and thought clearly. Constance called on a Tuesday at 10:22 a.m. She said the board wanted to speak with Chidinma about the institution and about her interest in helping them rebuild it. Chidinma was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she said, "I'm available Thursday." She came through the revolving glass doors 7 months and 11 days after the guard had handed her the envelope without looking at her face. Charcoal gray suit. The leather notebook under her arm. The lobby guard was not the same man. He said, "Good morning. Can I sign you in?" She said, "Chidinma Okafor. I have a meeting with the board." He found her name. He printed her badge. He said, "14th floor, ma'am. They're expecting you." The elevator opened on the 14th floor. The east-facing windows were the same. The light was the same. A woman she had never met came out of a side office and handed her a folder. Chidinma read it without slowing her pace down the corridor she had walked for 11 years. She reached the conference room. She pushed the door open. 7 board members were seated in a semicircle facing the entrance, and all 7 stood when she entered, not because anyone had told them to, but because the room arranged itself around her presence the way rooms always do when the right person finally arrives. Constance Mensah Owusu said, "Miss Okafor, "Thank you for coming." Chidinma said, "Thank you for calling." She sat at the head of the table. She set the leather notebook in front of her. She placed the appointment letter, board chairman, effective immediately, beside it. She looked at the people around the table. She said, "I want to start at the beginning. Let me show you what I found in March." Gerald Adeyemi thought he had handed Chidinma Okafor an ending. He had given her a single page, taken back a badge, and assumed the equation was closed. What he had not understood, what men in his position almost never understand until it is over, was that the people they dismiss do not disappear. They recalibrate. They go home and make tea on a stovetop before sunrise and open notebooks and write down everything they know. And what Chidinma knew, had always known, was worth more than anything that had ever been kept behind the glass doors of Meridian Capital Group. The things done to her on that Thursday morning did not diminish her. They released her. She stepped out of a building that had been using her for 11 years without ever seeing her, and she walked 9 blocks in the direction of everything she had already been building. Some people are handed their endings by someone who does not understand that what looks like a closed door is, to the right person, simply a change of location. The world does not always recognize what it is standing in the presence of. It looks at the $8 blazer, the exact change at the bottom of a bag, the woman at the east-facing window who stays 2 hours after everyone has gone, and it mistakes endurance for smallness. It mistakes record-keeping for passivity. It mistakes the quiet of someone who knows they are right for the quiet of someone who has given up. These are not the same quiet, not even close. If someone handed you the proof that they had been wrong, wrong about you, wrong about what you knew, wrong about your worth, what would you do with it? Not to make them suffer. To build something. What would you build? Think carefully. Leave your answer in the comments. I really want to read it. Subscribe for more stories about hidden strength, quiet power, and the people the world overlooks until they change everything. I'll see you in the next one.